Buenos días. Bienvenido.
Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for being with us. The road to recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean. A high-level discussion on the role of public health, education, and employment reactivation for moving beyond the pandemic. This is a virtual meeting organized by the World Bank within the framework of the annual meetings. This is being broadcast simultaneously in English and in Spanish. My name is Josefina Townsend, Peruvian journalist, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to moderate over this panel about the challenges for the future of our region, the most impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, in 2 rounds of questions, we will hear proposals by outstanding panelists, and we will be introducing them later on, about how they're facing and finding solutions to 3 key objectives for the post-COVID-19 recovery: strengthening Latin America and the Caribbean's public health response through vaccination campaigns, minimizing the long-term scarring by the crisis, concentrating on in-person programs and recovery programs, and supporting job creation, particularly for those most impacted by the crisis. Our hosts this morning are Axel von Trachtenberg, Director Manager, and Carlos Felipe Jaramillo, Vice President for Latin America and the Caribbean. We also have with us, following this broadcast, ministers from the region and special guests. So we greet you, and we're very grateful for your participation, and we invite you to share your viewpoints through the comment section, the chat that is at the bottom of the screen. It says Q&A, but what we want to hear from you are comments that you can share with us. And before I begin with the various presentations, we invite you to watch this video, Latin American and Caribbean citizens and their testimony on how the pandemic has impacted their lives and what are their hopes for the future. Please let us watch the video.
Soy Erika Cabero, tengo 41 años, tengo 3 hijos. Empecé con lo que son trabajos de call center.
Yo soy Luis Murillo, tengo 51 años, soy docente de primaria.
Soy Juan Pidolande, tengo 26 años, soy comunicador, locutor, conferencista y escritor.
I am Albert Jones. I am 55 years old. I am a prison officer, 27 years.
Eu sou Eliette Fonseca, tenho 62 anos. Sou professora aposentada.
La llegada de la pandemia para mí fue difícil porque justo había cambiado de trabajo, había entrado a un trabajo de atención al cliente en un restaurante y cuando empezó el tema de la cuarentena pues cerraron todo y ahí fue que me quedé pues como quien dice en la nada, ¿no?
En nivel de trabajo tuve que cambiar de tener una agenda de 40 y tantas conferencias presenciales, todo se fue al piso y automáticamente me tuve que adaptar a una situación que era inminente, la virtualidad.
Una vez que se dio este asunto de la pandemia, nosotros nos tuvieron que ir en la parte virtual. Para nosotros los docentes fue algo muy duro, muy fuerte que se fue dando. Cuando fallece mi papá, yo me sentí más culpable por no estar más en contacto con él, por el asunto que nos tuvimos que distanciar, por guardarnos la salud, y más las clases sincrónicas. Todo eso trajo conmigo un problema interno y eso me produjo mal carácter y prácticamente discusiones con mi esposa.
La experiencia sobre las clases online con mis hijos fue realmente complicado. Adquirir dispositivos que no habían en casa para que ellos también puedan conectarse. Sumarle eso también a un plan de internet. Tendrían que bajar precios para que sea accesible para todos.
The prison is a pretty hard place to not socialize as far as it terms the prisoners. Because remember, we have numbers to deal with, and we can't slot out 6 feet for everybody like that. At some point in time, there is going to be some closeness, some togetherness, you know. So it is a pretty hard thing that we are going through, but we will get through it.
as questões de atraso de vacina. Desde 19 eu tenho ficado muito triste com todas essas coisas. E a gente que tem problemas, que tem medo, né? Porque a gente é diabética, a gente já tem uma idade mais avançada, a gente ficou com medo de sair na rua, né? Enquanto isso, pessoas que estavam nem aí, né? Indo para a rua e acreditando nas fake news, acreditando em remédios malucos.
Moving forward, as far as COVID is concerned, Barbadians have to play their part. They have to protect themselves. They can't do this on your own. You must live good among your people.
Yo considero que las clases se den en forma presencial. Si en este mes de octubre comenzamos, podemos rescatar por lo menos algo de contenido para que el próximo año no sea tan fuerte, tan duro para los estudiantes.
Como comunicador, activista social de los derechos humanos y de los derechos de las personas con discapacidad, me siento en total responsabilidad de decirle a la gente, vamos, vacúnate, porque es la solución.
Mis sueños más importantes es poder ver a mis hijos logrados profesionalmente. Me lo imagino a mi hija en su oficina, en su consultorio particular, porque ella quiere ser psicóloga. Me imagino a mi hijo cumpliendo su sueño, él quiere estudiar comunicaciones, producción, entonces me lo imagino produciendo algo, un programa de televisión. Pero mi hijo, el de 9 años, quiere ser youtuber. Me lo imagino assim, sendo youtuber, não?
Que eu sou baiana de Salgueiro. Então o carnaval é uma das coisas que me dá mais alegria, uma das coisas mais tristes nessa pandemia foi ficar longe das minhas amigas baianas. A gente está sentindo falta é de se abraçar.
El latinoamericano es mucho de contacto físico y esto del distanciamiento físico me enseñó, y creo que nos ha enseñado a todos, a sonreír con el alma.
Son testimonios que nos conmueven.
These are testimonies that move us and inspire us at the same time. Let us hear now Axel van Trotzenberg. Axel, good morning, Managing Director of Operations for the World Bank. Axel.
Thank you very much, Sofina. It's a pleasure to be here, and I would really like to welcome everybody here on this discussion about the road to recovery. And we will discuss today particularly how public health, education, job creation can contribute to a sustained recovery in Latin America. These are incredibly important topics. I'm very pleased that I'm joined by the Minister of Finance from Guyana, Ashish Singh, as well as the Minister of Education from Panama, Maruja Corday de Villalobos, by the Minister of Health from Ecuador, Dr. Jimena Garzon Villalba, as well as the Deputy Director of the Department of National Planning from Colombia, Daniel Gomez Gaviria. So welcome to this. It is always important when we have the discussion to say what is actually the situation. And particularly with COVID, we should always keep in mind that in Latin America, COVID had a devastating impact. It accounted for 1/4 of the global cases. It also accounted for 1/3 of the global deaths related to COVID. It also saw its economy contracting as one of the strongest, namely 6.5%, and 30 million people lost their jobs. So these are staggering figures. And what is more is that this may have lasting effects if we don't take corrective measures. Take on the public health system, we are still in the crisis. So what we need first is to make sure that everybody can get the vaccines. And what we have seen is that while we have progress, we also see that there is inequality of treatment, and that many people who are more vulnerable still are waiting for vaccines. So that is one of the big challenges. I think over the last couple of months, there have been good progress, but more needs still to be done. Secondly, I think also as we get out of the pandemic, we need to think on how we can sustainably improve health systems, as well as that particularly the preparedness plans of governments are strengthened so that if there is a new pandemic coming, we're better prepared to confront it and contain the cost and particularly the human suffering. Secondly, on the education, we saw elsewhere in the whole world schools being closed and many children not able to attend school, or that education has only had limited access, if you namely had access to an iPad or so. And what it means is that here again, particularly the most vulnerable have been suffering from this, and particular also girls. There is an enormous challenge to get everybody back to school, especially girls. So that is something we have to look at, because the losses these children have suffered as a result of lack of education may in the long term translate of less earning capacity. And then also on the job market, I think that is intrinsically linked to the economic recovery of this. And I think what we need to see is how can we make sure that it is a stronger recovery. What we are at the World Bank emphasizing is the word GRID, green, resilient, inclusive development, meaning that how can we build back better, maybe also with more green investment, that it should be more sustainable and especially inclusive, as too many groups have been excluded. And this is always a challenge in Latin America, that groups tend, particularly the vulnerable group, tend to be discriminated against it. And we need to be learning from past experience. I think what we need to use today's discussion is really to hear how countries are confronting these challenges, how they are devising new plans for the recovery, and how the international community can be supportive in their efforts. And certainly the World Bank stands ready to do whatever it takes. We have, during the crisis, developed and executed a program of $157 billion worldwide over a 50 months period, and 29 billion was dedicated to Latin America. We want to continue with this strong engagement, and this is going to be necessary not only from the World Bank, but also multilateral institutions as well. That is what I think we will also need to see, how a World Bank can best support the efforts by the individual governments. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I think it is an important one, and done right, it provides new opportunities and hopefully also hope for many people in Latin America. Back to you, Josefina.
Gracias, Axel. Muchas gracias. Presentamos ahora.
Thank you, Axel. Thank you very much. And now let me introduce our distinguished panelists: Jimena Garzón Villalba, Minister of Health of Ecuador; Maruja Gorday de Villalobos, Minister of Education, Panama; Ajni Singh, Minister of Finance, Guyana; and Daniel Gomez Gaviria, Deputy Director of the Department of National Planning in Colombia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. During this first part, we have a response to COVID-19 and the current situation. And Garzón Villalba will be the first one. How was Ecuador able to surpass this initial stage? Can you hear me okay? This initial deployment, somewhat complicated to one of the fastest paces in deployment in the world. How do you think that this strategy places your country with a view to the recovery, post-pandemic recovery? Hello, Josefina. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the World Bank Group for the invitation. In fact, Ecuador has done extraordinary work in the vaccination plan, thanks to the leadership of our President of the Republic. Without being an epidemiologist, he had the vision of vaccinating a significant percentage of the population during these days. We were estimating 72% of the population that was subject to vaccination in just a short period of time. And that was done because of multilateral support, obviously, and multi-strategic support provided by several sectors in the country, both private as well as public. Getting the vaccines was essential. It was a work that had to do with the diplomacy of vaccines, as we called it in our country. Our own president called on the phone many of his colleagues, heads of state and government in many countries in the world, ambassadors, in order to procure the raw material that would be used in order to implement a strategic plan. That was developed starting in December last year, but by a group of experts convened by the president to be able to work on this plan. When we arrived at the Ministry of Public Education, we had already developed this plan with scientific evidence developed by experts in vaccines and epidemiologists. And once we took office in the ministry, this became part of the reality of our country, especially regarding resources, because we had developed the plan, but we did not know about the reality that we were going to face in the health sector. And once here at the helm of the ministry, we were able to see how the cold chain was behaving human resources. And to this, we add the will of all the people of Ecuador. In fact, we're all working shoulder to shoulder, the public sector, the private sector, private enterprises, the armed forces in Ecuador, Red Cross, universities, Boy Scouts, and all focused on attaining the same objective, vaccinating as many people as possible in the population in the shortest period of time, the 100 days proposed by the president. Without the support of all, we would have not been able to achieve this. There was no individualisms here. We stressed having complied with the principles of the group, equality, equity, because the vaccines were available to all the people in Ecuador, even for the people that are not citizens and residents in Ecuador, but are living in the country. And even those people that do not have a regular migratory status, there has been equality. The vaccines have been made available in all strata, ages, socioeconomic levels, in all regions of the country. Obviously, there has been concern for human well-being. At the same time that we implemented our vaccination plan, we also improved the conditions and infrastructure and in hospital care. It had been quite neglected in the last few years. There was respect for the human being because vaccination centers, both public as well as municipal centers, those in universities, private centers, we always worry about the dignity of the people that were going to be vaccinated and also those who were going to administer the vaccines. Reciprocity, because the first people vaccinated in the country were those that exposed their life controlling the pandemic, the health personnel. They were the first ones in receiving the vaccines, and then other priority groups such as teachers, police agents, etc. The processes have been completely transparent, and the distribution of vaccines has been on equal footing throughout the country, depending on the population. We vaccinated 2.5% of the total population in Ecuador in just 2 days, one in July and another one in August, where we were able to administer 414,000 doses of vaccines against COVID in the entire population. To date, we've covered 72% of the population as of the age of 12. And our objective is to reach 85% of the population by December. Obviously, this strategy is positioning Ecuador in an extraordinary place in this return to normalcy. As soon as we've vaccinated 85% of the total population subject to vaccines, that we will begin as of October 15 with this vaccination, starting with children, 5-year-olds, and then by December, we would have reached the so desired community immunity, herd immunity. This is already being seen in our country. We see economic and social reactivation. Schools are open again. We have activities, some in person, some virtual, many economic activities, such as the reopening of theaters and restaurants, and also, for example, soccer matches and other cultural activities that are so important for society. We have a limited capacity. We have implemented in our country the Phoenix plan, which is a comprehensive epidemic control plan, which entails monitoring, continuous monitoring, epidemiological surveillance, and immediate control of outbreaks when detected. Genotypification that is done here in the country to determine the type of variant that we have enables us to act right away with brigades for outbreak control. And thanks to geo-referencing system that we've implemented, it has enabled us to control very well the Delta variant that affects many countries in the world, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as other variants, typical variants such as the Mu and the Lambda variants. Even though they're not more contagious and they do not increase or raise the mortality rate, these are variants that are of concern because they have not been tested by other European countries that do not wreak a major havoc. We've had an excellent result with the vaccines. In the country, we have AstraZeneca, we have Pfizer, we have the Sinovac, we have Cancino, and that has enabled us to reach the most remote rural populations and to have very well controlled these COVID outbreaks in the country. Hospital systems are no longer that overcrowded. We don't have patients waiting. We also see intensive care units opening up. And that has enabled us to reactivate the care of other pathologies and diseases that were neglected for some time. We had surgical participations that we're waiting, and so we're reactivating our country thanks to a good strategy in public health. Thank you very much, Minister. Minister Gorday de Villalobos, the pandemic threatens to have a long-lasting impact on the health of young people because of the closing of schools. What is Panama doing in order to offset the losses in learning, and so that the pandemic would not heighten the inequalities? Investments were made in virtual education during the pandemic. Do you think this is another possibility to reconsider in broader terms the way in which education will be given in the future, or more broadly in the future? Good morning. I'd like to thank the World Bank for this significant opportunity to express what we've been able to do. Part of that support with some experts in the bank to greet the ministers and delegates who are with us. And I felt very close when I was listening to the Minister of Health of Ecuador saying that they've already begun this process in which we have partly in person. We already have educational centers that are open, and we should begin with the good news. Definitely, the pandemic for us has represented a major challenge. Before the pandemic, we already faced challenges, significant challenges with elementary school students. The levels of reading and understanding told us that we had to find some other paths, and also with the recent PISA tests. However, this pandemic has hardened what happens in our educational communities and in our context, so particularly in these poorest part of the population, where we have 40% of the population, school population, where we have areas of difficult access, or where there's no water, where we have school ranch schools, or where there's no connectivity, where we see multidimensional poverty that is already evidenced on a map, and where we have a country strategy that is called the Plan Colmena, launched by the President of the Republic, that points to a comprehensive development. However, for us, that was of significant impact. We have been able to bring about some strategies, and I'll share this with you, but I simply wanted to let you know that in the country, we have 31% of connectivity of the spectrum in educational communities. The issue of connectivity has been seriously impacted, and access to technological devices. On the other hand, besides learning, which is a basic and essential and part of this forum, is in order to deal with the social and emotional aspect and the mental health of our students. On the other hand, something that I have to stress by being a teacher in special education, that access to education, that technological adaptation of resources and participation of students with the disabilities, people with the disabilities, not only in the educational process during the pandemic, but access to health. However, we were able to develop some strategies, and I will briefly go into these. We were able to develop partnerships for development with TV stations, and we have over 4,000 air hours in production in solidarity partnership that has been covered by the Ministry of Education and by the central government in over $50 million, as has been assessed, even triggering programs in the original languages, Luna Gaya and Loberi languages, which are part of the languages spoken by our native peoples. On the other hand, partnerships with official and private universities to create this platform and to be able to level off our students in middle education. The boys and girls who started in 2019, 10th grade, which is the last part of the middle school, are this year completing the school without having spent the 2 years in person in school, and everything that entails the use of laboratories, professional practice, interrelation, and what implies not being in the educational center, being absent. Materials available through our project, Let Us All Learn How to Read, which was a strategy that had been designed previously in 2019, which was going to be highly focused in 2020, and we were able to cover that distance. However, we currently have all the materials, printed materials, already distributed, over 3 million materials this year in the prioritized curriculum, first to ninth grade for basic subject matters for elementary school and for middle school, updating the material for the education given in schools, basic and multi-degree schools that has been going on for 15 years, and it had not been updated during the 15 years. And now I will go into digital technology. We entered into a partnership with government entities, the institution that governs this education in the country, and we created a multimodal platform known as Esther. This platform to date has created over 4,314 schoolrooms, and it was able to bring together over 2,000 virtual learning objectives for 16 grades. That is to say, students that are about to finish in 2020 and in 2021. That enriched the process. And on the other hand, we were able to activate 100% of mail accounts and to trigger 75% of participation in the office platform. On the other hand, the government developed a solidarity plan to be able to provide a connectivity to 35% of our students. And on the other hand, a whole plan to provide social and emotional support to students that to date has been highly demanded because of mental health and emotional health. However, in partnership with the legislative branch. And I believe that I will talk about this when we come to the second part. We presented a law that promotes a policy of digital equality, a large scale, that has an impact on basic services, connectivity, and particularly it has an impact on the initial training of teachers, and it has an impact on the improvement of a curriculum by digital skills. So very briefly, we already have 91% of our teachers vaccinated, and with the Panavar strategy, over 60% of the population. We are the fifth country in the world. I know that Ecuador is ahead of us, but the fifth country in the world already with over 60% of the population vaccinated. And this brings hope and brings opportunities getting ready for a year of elections, 2022.
Thank you very much, Minister Gorday de Villalobos. Mr. Gomez Gaviria, during the pandemic, we have seen some of the fastest rises in unemployment in Black history, but labor markets are starting to recover, even though we still have challenges. What is Colombia doing to ensure that the most negatively affected people by the pandemic, women and vulnerable groups in particular, can rejoin the labor market and find productive employment? Thank you very much. I would like to send greetings to Axel, Carlos Felipe, and all colleagues in other countries. Colombia in 2020 had a recession which was comparable to the recessions of the rest of the region in the world, but it was particularly severe in the increase in unemployment. It was much worse than other countries in the region. And what happened was that with COVID, we saw the reduction of employment offerings in the labor market, and we have to improve that in the future. This had a great differential effect in women and the young population of our country. Why in women? Because during the COVID pandemic, we had isolation and quarantines, and this intensified the responsibility for care. And this responsibility for care is mainly on women. There is a gender bias in the economy of care of old people, children. All household work is done by women, and we saw a transference of the economic activity. The market was closed to many workers, and women stayed at home. Schools were closed. Young people had to remain at home, and that was an additional charge for women in particular. What we are seeing now is a reactivation, and it's asymmetric in nature. The reactivation of employment is not symmetrical at all. Youth have special difficulties due to their lack of experiences and professional or job experience, and women because of the need to stay at home to care for other people, and also the nature of the activities that have been reactivating makes it more difficult for these groups of people. Some of the slowest activities to reactivate are activities or jobs filled by women. And what are we doing in Colombia to face this? What have we done since the pandemic to reduce this impact on the employment and on poverty? So what are we doing during the reactivation to accelerate and support the recovery of jobs? First of all, we had the PAEF, the Program of Support to Formal Employment. It was a support of 40% of the minimum wage for companies who hired workers and maintained workers during the pandemic. This was subject to a criteria of eligibility determined by the amount of sale losses in 2020. This PAEF program also had a gender perspective. It was a very important ingredient. The benefit was improved from 40 to 60% for women, recognizing the fact that there was a differential effect for women. we think the program has reached 142,000 employers with 4.1 million jobs created. We also launched in June 2021 the program for employment subsidies, which seeks to reduce some of the barriers when it comes to non-wage costs for youth employment. There's a subsidy of 25% of the minimum wage for each young person between 18 and 25 years of age who is hired and whose wages are less than the minimum wage in Colombia. These formal employment support programs have been promoted by the Law of Social Investment, which we approved in September 2021 in Congress. And they are also complemented, and I think this is very important, they complement the strategy of social policies with cash transfers, conditioned and non-conditioned cash transfer, particularly the non-conditioned cash transfers. The program of Solidarity Employment was created to support the income of vulnerable households. And it was also very important to allow us to have a participation of these households in the labor market. We had an impact evaluation of the program together with the IDB and IBA, and we saw that there was no negative incentive for labor participation. This is very interesting as a result because it means that this minimum transfer allows households to have a productive and active social life and can also take part in the labor sector. And the third axis I would like to mention is the axis of immediate reactivation in the Equity Committee by the government. We generated a series of strategies to improve the matching between vacancies and unemployed persons during the reactivation period. We had employment fairs, we had a public employment service, we had the coordination between cities where the highest unemployment rate was registered, and the government mobilized quickly towards orienting people towards new employment. Thank you very much, Mr. Gomez Gavidia. Mr. Sim, across the region, we have seen debt levels rapidly rising as countries have massively increased spending to respond to the crisis. Given the needs in terms of health, education, social protection, and labor that the other ministers have mentioned, how should countries think about prioritizing spending while maintaining sustainable fiscal balances?
Thank you very much, Josefina, and greetings to Axel, Felipe, and all of the other panelists and participants in this very important event. You mentioned in the question the issue of debt, and you're absolutely, of course, right that probably more than anywhere else in the world, the Latin American Caribbean region has felt the brunt of the economic and fiscal impact of the pandemic, with many of our countries facing devastating shocks to the productive sector, rapid expansion of the fiscal deficit, and the sharpest accumulation of debt in nearly 2 decades. Nowhere was this more evident than amongst the tourism-dependent countries of the Caribbean, whose economies contracted by more than 10% in 2020, pushing debt levels to 90% of GDP across the sub-region, and in some individual countries to well over 100% of GDP. This places LAC in a particularly precarious position, and the times remain uncertain as we continue to grapple with the pandemic that refuses to go away. As we consider the difficult fiscal choices before us, the following imperatives are unavoidable. First, we must do all we can to keep our people alive, safe, and well. This necessitates ensuring adequate capacity in the healthcare system, access by the entire population to food, potable water, and sanitation, especially given the ongoing threat to livelihood faced by the most vulnerable, and access to vaccines given the scientific evidence on vaccine efficacy. In Guyana, for example, we've pursued an aggressive vaccination campaign, achieving to date first dose coverage of 71% and second dose coverage of 42% of the adult population. And amongst the adolescent population, 35% first dose coverage and 20% second dose coverage. Second, we must contain damage to the economy. This will likely involve a phased reopening of the economy without compromising the safety of our people. It might also involve some measure of support to help ensure that the private sector can navigate the crisis and survive financially. In Guyana, we rolled out a universal cash transfer program delivering COVID-19 cash grants to every household across the country. This injected essential liquidity into the household sector and by extension helped to kickstart a resumption of economic activity. Third, we must lay the foundation for full recovery and sustained economic growth in the medium and longer term. This we do by addressing and alleviating the most critical prevailing impediments to growth. In many countries, these will include catalytic infrastructure, human capital development, technological advances, and the business environment. In Guyana, we are focusing heavily on addressing all aspects of this agenda with a view to ensuring a well-diversified and resilient economy going forward. Let us be clear, the response to containment of and recovery from the pandemic will not be realized without disruption to the pre-pandemic fiscal framework. The clear and immediate implication is that countries will need to revise their macroeconomic frameworks to accommodate higher fiscal deficits in the near and short term. At the same time, the crisis reaffirms the urgency with which countries need to reorient their budgets towards more efficient and productive spending for the longer term. The challenge before us really is to strike the right balance in determining when and how to tighten the fiscal stance without affecting the quality of the recovery. In some respects, the current circumstance is a classic illustration of the need to ensure that we are not penny-wise and pound-foolish. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Ministro Sim.
Thank you very much, Minister Sim. Thank you very much. That is the end of the first round of questions. And before going into the second round, we have an interview with Daniel Carvajalino, who's a young Colombian entrepreneur. She's an activist in the field of education, and she founded a platform of virtual courses on technology, entrepreneurship, and marketing. Let us go to that interview, which I made with Daniela before this event.
Hay más de 150 millones de jóvenes viviendo en América Latina y el Caribe hoy, quienes no solo deben hacer frente a los desafíos generados por la pandemia, sino también a los retos que ya existían previamente. Daniela, en tu trabajo con emprendedores, en tu trabajo como activista de la educación en la región, ¿cómo estás viendo su reacción ante los desafíos del presente?
Yo creo que los jóvenes hemos tomado la pandemia con mucha resiliencia. Somos una generación que ha demostrado, especialmente la generación de jóvenes emprendedores, los cuales vivimos épocas realmente difíciles, que somos capaces, que queremos ser parte del cambio. Al mismo tiempo, enfrentamos diferentes desafíos que hacen que, dependiendo de las oportunidades que tú tengas, puedas enfrentar esos retos de diferentes maneras. Quisiéramos, por ejemplo, ver más mujeres en startups, más mujeres en tecnología, pero al mismo tiempo, tener o no tener acceso a conectividad o a internet crea una diferencia muy grande para una persona que quiere emprender, para una persona que quiere estudiar, y asimismo difiere la manera en la que podemos enfrentar esos retos. Así que si yo tuviera que resumir en una palabra cómo los jóvenes lo estamos enfrentando, yo diría que con mucha resiliencia, con mucha acción, pero al mismo tiempo también demandando cambio en las cosas que estamos viendo y en las oportunidades y brechas digitales y brechas de educación que se están presentando.
Entonces, cuéntanos un poco más de esas demandas que tienen los jóvenes para poder emprender el camino hacia la recuperación.
Yo tuve la oportunidad en Colombia particularmente de participar en múltiples mesas de diálogo y me llamó mucho la atención que en muchas de estas mesas de diálogo se repetía constantemente una palabra, y esa palabra era educación. Lo importante de esta demanda de educación es que no es cualquier tipo de educación, es una educación adaptada a las necesidades del siglo XXI, pero muy especialmente adaptada a los cambios y a la transformación digital que dejó la pandemia. una educación que permita acceder a mejores y a buenas oportunidades laborales o que permita emprender, porque definitivamente causa una diferencia en la vida de una persona el tipo de educación que tenga. Así que creo que definitivamente ahí se basa mucho de muchos pedidos de un futuro más verde, de un futuro más incluyente, de un futuro más resiliente, pero sobre todo un futuro con educación que nos permita acceder a más y a mejores oportunidades.
Y Daniela, en tu emprendimiento, donde además apoyas a personas en situación de vulnerabilidad, ¿cómo se enfrentó a la pandemia? ¿Qué impacto tuvo la pandemia en ustedes y cómo lo enfrentaron?
Bueno, nosotros somos una empresa de base tecnológica y de educación. La pandemia para nosotros fue una locura porque llegó un momento donde todos estábamos encerrados en nuestras casas. Nosotros particularmente decidimos abrir absolutamente todo el contenido que tenemos gratis para todos y fue un momento donde los emprendedores están pasando muy difícil y los emprendedores que no tenían ni idea de marketing digital, de cómo vender por internet, todas esas cosas, tuvieron la oportunidad de tomar un curso y decir, bueno, ya no puedo vender físicamente porque tengo mi tienda cerrada, pero qué bueno que pueda aprender a vender por internet. Entonces, para nosotros fue un momento de oportunidad de poder ayudar a muchos emprendedores, más de 10,000 emprendedores, y también una oportunidad de aprender que la educación online no simplemente era una misión de hacer empresa y de ayudar, sino que de verdad es una manera de transformar la vida, porque vimos la vida de muchas personas transformarse por tener información que permitía que sus negocios crecieran y que por lo menos operaran, porque los emprendedores que no tenían este tipo de conocimiento de transformación digital no lo podían hacer. Así que realmente fue una oportunidad de llegar a muchas más personas, pero sobre todo de que nos convencimos y cambiamos y reestructuramos todo, porque creemos firmemente que la educación online es la manera en la que nosotros podemos transformar y ayudar a que muchas personas alrededor del mundo, especialmente los jóvenes, puedan acceder a mejores oportunidades laborales y que puedan emprender y no fallar en el proceso o poder acceder a financiamiento.
Daniela, muchas gracias.
A ti, Josefina.
Daniela además ha participado en los últimos meses.
Daniela has also been a spokesperson for the campaign called Futuristas. It's a project together with the World Bank. With this message shared by Daniela, we go to the second round of discussion for our panelists. The theme is moving towards a long-term, inclusive and sustainable human capital accumulation and economic growth in the long term. Minister Jaramillo, the pandemic has had a major impact on jobs, but even before the crisis, the region was confronting a rapidly changing labor market, new forms of work, automation, and the rise of the digital economy. How to ensure that youth acquire the skills they need to compete in an increasingly complex and interconnected world? Well, I believe the tangible way to guarantee that youth can do this is that countries and educational systems have public policies which are durable, sustainable over time, which are geared towards those vulnerable groups, and that are able to impact and close this gap, which is not only a knowledge gap, but it is also a poverty and inequality gap. Through this acceleration in technology in the educational fields, we were able to recover 11,000 students in this year, which deserted the school system in the last year. We had a network for educational insertion that was very helpful in this regard. And 14,000 students, 15% of this population, migrated towards official and public schools. And it's also very important to point out that this pandemic scenario must lead us to develop inclusive public policies to make these vulnerable groups more visible, particularly those who live in the highest poverty areas in the country, and those who are not most visible, such as women, children, and persons with disability. If we modernize education, if we develop digital skills, we will be down the right road. and we have a draft law which is before Congress, but we need resources and financing to be able to materialize this project. We have a bill before Congress right now, and maybe next month we will be able to start implementing the law. It will support the improvement of skills in our young population. It has very crucial aspects such as the updating of computational abilities to bring them into the 21st century, as UNESCO recommends, the handling of educational platforms with flexible modalities, which will lead us to a new vision of the educational environment needed by our country. We have the need to improve face-to-face education, education through homeschooling as well. We will be able to have tele-education, and we will have a hybrid structure because of the different circumstances that our country is living through, particularly the pandemics. And we need to develop creativity and technological innovation in our country at the same time as we strengthen the supply of materials of many types, audiovisual, printed materials, etc. And I think that will be the way to improve the competitive abilities of our young people. If our countries have these kind of resources and financing, we will be able to effect change for our youth and also for our children, early childhood included. We will be able to close that gap in this inequality, and Panamanians will be ready for the future, because we need to prepare them for tomorrow, and we need them to be people who have the skills required for the future. I think the influence we are having in early childhood and youth is visible through all the policies we are applying at present, and the pandemic has accelerated this process. We require technical and financial support in order to implement these programs. Thank you very much, Minister. Director Gomez Gavidia, as Minister Cordero Villalobos mentioned, skills are very important. What are the policies that you need to improve and create better jobs for the future? Well, this is a very important point. In the pandemics, when we were thinking about economic reactivation in our country, we saw that one of the channels for the transmission of these impacts that could be producing the inequality problems in the future, in the lack of social mobility, was precisely the channel of human capital insufficiency. The consequences of the interruption of education in 2020 can produce severe impacts in the accumulation of human capital and in the closing of gaps towards the future. So in Colombia, within the reactivation policy approved by the Economic and Social Council, we approved the policy 4023, which had certain strategies to reactivate with inclusivity and equity. Inclusivity in the search for strategies to reduce school desertion by kids in our country. And we designed a strategy to allow the young people of vulnerable households to go to school and avoid the desertion of schools in a more permanent way. This was geared towards producing new capabilities in our youth and reactivating employment. So this policy of reactivation led us to implement a series of strategies for high school education and the creation of skills in sectors that are to be reactivated through the use of SENA, our learning agency. We had a national framework for qualifications, which includes a series of strategic sectors geared towards improving the quality of education and qualifications by our young people, so that those who are leaving high school can find jobs very quickly in this reactivation era. And this has very important structural and long-term implications. And for the whole region, I think we should use the COVID pandemic to improve our capabilities in our young people and make them ready for employment once they leave school. And these problems are made worse by the pandemic, and also the fact that there has been a digital and a job transformation, and we have to rethink our employment systems and on the job training systems. Education and employment must be reconsidered in order to avoid an increase of the rates of unemployment in our country. Thank you very much, Mr. Gomez Gavidia. I understand you have to leave us. Thank you for your words. Now, Minister Singh, before the pandemic, Latin America and the Caribbean were already contending with structural challenges for ensuring sustainable and inclusive economic growth. We hopefully will begin to move out of the pandemic in the coming months. What do you think are the key priorities to reignite productivity and economic growth in the region?
Thanks again, Josefina. This question causes me to reflect on the kind of growth, the type of growth that we need now more particularly to seek. In my mind, the crisis presents an opportunity, indeed a very urgent necessity, for us to redouble our efforts to achieve rapid, robust, and resilient growth going forward. Rapid, because our economy simply cannot sustain a prolonged period of subdued activity. Robust, because anything less will fall short of ensuring that we return to fiscal sustainability and will not assure us of achieving the development objectives that we've set ourselves. And resilient, because here again, nothing less is needed if we are to avoid lurching from one crisis to another, as we appear to have been doing for such a long time. What do we need to do now to lay the foundation for this rapid, robust, and resilient growth we seek? First, as I mentioned earlier when I addressed the previous question, immediate interventions are needed and indeed are being implemented by many of our countries to limit the damage to the economy as a result of the ongoing pandemic and to stimulate a recovery. Second, diversification of the productive sector cannot be postponed any longer. Particularly in some of the smaller countries in our regions, economic diversification has long been an elusive objective. There have been few crises in the past that have driven home more severely the vulnerability that arises from an economy that is dominated by one or two productive sectors. Thirdly, we need to accelerate efforts to improve productivity and competitiveness. In many of our countries, there remains significant potential to harness more fully the benefits of technology, including information and communications technology, as a means of improving productivity. This crisis has amply illustrated the potential of ICT and our capacity to roll out ICT and other technology-based solutions in the shortest possible time if the circumstances require it. And fourthly, there's no more important investment that can be made and that needs to be made than investing in human capital. A well-educated workforce equipped with the skills needed by the economy of the future is an essential prerequisite both to improving productivity and also to catalyzing greater innovation in all facets of economic activity. I wish to make two final points.
Deseo señalar dos comentarios finales.
I wish to make two final points. First, I wish to emphasize that both in the recovery from the crisis as well as the agenda for longer-term growth, we must place at the very center of our policy matrix the importance of returning people to work in the short term, particularly those whose livelihoods have been disrupted by the crisis. Creating more jobs so that our entire working population has an opportunity to participate both in the recovery and in the growth beyond. And finally, promoting higher labor market participation, including by addressing labor market mismatches, such as by training and retraining where needed. And of course, our colleague from Colombia addressed this issue in great detail. Finally, we cannot discuss sustainable economic growth without addressing that other currently unfolding existential crisis, the climate crisis. Here again, nowhere in the world are we more aware of the reality of climate vulnerability than in the Caribbean. Much has been said, of course, about building back better. We need very urgently to accelerate the transition to clean and renewable energy, as well as to give greater global recognition to the contribution made by standing forests, such as ours in Guyana in the global fight against climate change. In this regard, it's probably fortuitous that we're having this discussion on the eve of COP26 to be held in Glasgow, Scotland in just a few days to come. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Ministro Singh. Muchas gracias. Ministra Garzón.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister Guillalba, based on the answers given regarding on how to reactivate the economy in Latin America and growth in the Caribbean, do you believe that we're better prepared to respond to future pandemics and thus be able to minimize the danger entailed for sustainable and inclusive growth in the region? Yes, Josefina, obviously, I think that we're better prepared than before. We had never been through a pandemic. This is the first time that in the modern days, Latin America and the Caribbean have had to go through this epidemiological event of this size. What has this taught us? Well, to be solidary, definitely. We need to work together, shoulder to shoulder, in countries and between countries, and also at a global level. We need to remember that equity, global equality and access to vaccines is an essential pillar to be able to bring out our countries with their scarce resources and for them to forge ahead. Without solidarity in countries, we could not do this. During this pandemic, we've seen that a robust public health will enable us to come afloat economically and socially, forge ahead in our country. The President of the Republic, besides launching the opportunity laws, which will enable us to reactivate our country, Ecuador, after a blow, an economic blow that has left us with very high debts. With a complex economic situation, and during these days, we see how this implementation of the vaccination plan in just a short period of time, with a large number of people, together with the comprehensive control of the pandemic, thanks to the plan in the country, and it has so been stated by the President of the Republic, has been the best economic plan in Ecuador. It is enabling us to bring back economic and socially a reactivation of the country. We will be better in the future. I am certain of that. We are drawing the best experiences in order to share these at a global level, and for this to never happen again. This pandemic took us by surprise. Not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but the entire world. We have learned major lessons, and undoubtedly we will implement these for this and never to happen again. In our country, we are developing strategies in order to implement our own production centers of biologicals and biosimilars, so as not to depend ever again and be in the hands of manufacturers that at a global level saw their production collapsed. And obviously then supporting ourselves amongst Latin American countries, maybe we can produce the amount of biologicals that we need in order to protect the region. Besides, obviously, finding support in many other public health strategies that we ourselves are introducing and that we'd like to have the entire Latin America and the Caribbean share in this, for this to never happen again. We know that sustainable and inclusive growth in the region implies development and modernization of public health in our countries. Minister, thank you very much. And to conclude with this exchange of ideas, this exchange of proposals, let us hear Carlos Felipe Jaramillo. Good morning. Please go ahead. Good morning. Thank you very much, Josefina, and thank you very much to all those who've participated in this very interesting dialogue. Extremely interesting and full of content participations. And I'd simply like to rescue some conclusions by way of closing remarks and stressing the urgent need for reactivating the development pillars for our region in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would summarize this in the three main topics. The first one is vaccination. Accelerating vaccination campaigns, particularly in the last 3 months in the region, is very good news. And it explains why we see the significant recovery in the economic activity of the entire region. To move forward in this vaccination process for the entire population is essential in order to put an end to the worst of this pandemic. And I commend those countries that have taken significant strides. The highest figures in Latin America are in the hands of Chile and Uruguay. They vaccinated over 75% of their population with 2 doses, with a full schedule. But I'd like to stress the major achievements that the administration of President Lasso in Ecuador, that was very well described by the minister here today, that has led to more than 50% of the population in just a short period of time, in 100 days, has been vaccinated with the 2 doses. And I'd also like to commend the Minister Singh for the effort made by Guyana, because it's also followed an admirable pace in vaccinations. All of this shows what can be done with good leadership and with logistic efforts that involves the entire country. The second point is the issue of education. And I believe that we have heard here, particularly by Minister Gorday de Villalobos from Panama, that the educational cost, the cost brought about by the pandemic, we believe that in the entire region, we've lost a significant amount of education. Students have lost, in most of the cases, as a minimum 1 full year of education. And there are countries where we're dangerously coming close to 2 years of losses. So it is a priority, and I agree with the panelist, to have students go back to school as soon as possible. And an effort has to be made in order to attract those students that run the risk of dropping out. I commend Panama and all the other countries that have already been able to reopen this, most than half of their schools with all the necessary protocols, obviously, and also those that are preparing remedial plans, particularly to recover the ground, the lost ground. And I'd like to bring up the digital issue. I believe that we've all agreed in seeing that unequal access to the internet in our region is still very partial. Only half of the people in Latin America and the Caribbean have access to it. It's been a huge disadvantage for those who don't have the access, and particularly for young people to be able to participate in the economy of the future. We see that it is a key to invest in this connectivity infrastructure. And last but not least, employment. I believe that this was clearly stated, the role of the policies of the state in order to reactivate this employment, particularly by the Deputy Director of Planning in Colombia and Minister Singh in Guyana. As we've heard from them, we see that the loss in employment was huge. The impact has been quite significant, particularly women and young people, and job creation is now a priority throughout the region. Reducing the informality is a priority in the region, and reforms have to be introduced. Some of these will be difficult and complex, but they are essential. I believe that the pandemic has shown that we have to rethink certain policies, particularly in labor markets, how to attract investment, how to improve our productivity in the smallest countries. As Minister Singh said, the issue of diversification, which is quite significant. And once again, digital innovations, the new technologies that might help us create thousands or millions of jobs and new opportunities. We need these investments in connectivity and also in providing the skills, the digital skills that were mentioned by Daniel Gomez that will be needed by the jobs of the future. And I conclude by saying that this crisis compels us to rethink where we stand and where we're headed, and to set in motion policies that not only will help us come out of the crisis, but to rebuild much better. And in this, I believe that it is essential to encourage growth. We have to make sure that innovation and productivity are promoted in the region, the new modalities, the new forms of work, digital issues, and new jobs, and particularly employment generation, job creation, which might bring opportunities for the young people of the future. I believe that this has been quite an enriching debate, and we have to learn. Some of us learn from the others. This is what we were trying to discuss here today, and I thank you all for your participation. So back to you, Josefina. Thank you very much, Carlos Felipe. Thank you very much for your participation in this event, and especially to the ministers who've been with us. Jimena Garzón Villalba, Minister of Health of Ecuador, Maruja Gorday de Villalobos, Minister of Education of Panama, Ashley Singh, Minister of Finance of Guyana, and Daniel Gomez Gaviria, Deputy Sector Director of the National Planning Department of Colombia. Thank you all for having participated in this high-level event where we went over the direct relation between vaccine coverage, economic creation through job creation, and the importance of the return to in-person schools in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we don't want to bid you farewell without saying that we'd like to invite you to an event on the 21st of October, organized by the government of Ecuador with the support of the World Bank. And on that occasion, the discussion will deal with the coverage of vaccination. Thank you very much and good morning.